search and print.
Yeah.
We are live.
Okay, good.
Well, it is good to see everyone, and it's good to be back. It was a fun trip, but it's really good to be home. I hope things went well here. Thank you, Dan, for covering my class last week.
You're welcome.
Do you all have fun doing some of the context exercises with Dan?
Yeah. They were
Yeah,
hard.
they're hard. And that's good. It's good for us to stretch our minds a little bit. And we're going to continue the theme of difficult things because we are now getting into word studies. Now, before we jump into word studies, does anybody have any questions or comments or anything about the discussions about context that we've had over the last month? We've talked about the historical cultural context, we've talked about the literary context, we've digested context a lot. And context is key. It's key to everything. And especially when we get into word studies, we're going to see that understanding the context is essential. So any thoughts, questions, comments on context before we jump in? Yes, sir?
Is there a handout?
Yes, there is. Sense?
Oh, then and Papa walked in later.
Hey, Paul, want to grab me?
Sure.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you. Okay, and we're probably only going to get through page 1 of that handout today. Maybe only the first point on the first page. We'll see. Okay, so the first question is, what are word studies? We say we're going to do word studies, but what are word studies?
Looking for definitions.
Dissection. Dissection.
Dissection. So word studies involve looking at the meaning of individual words in their original language, such as Greek or Hebrew, to gain a deeper understanding of the text. Now, I looked for definitions of word studies, and you can get the technical definition of it, what Webster says, but that doesn't really help you understand what we're doing with it. We're looking at the meaning of these individual words to understand the text better. So the question becomes, why should we do word studies?
Well, we live in a world with the spoken English is a very dynamic language.
Right.
They have to create a new dictionary every year.
Right. Yeah, English is a living language, and it changes and morphs, and we're going to actually talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Yeah. So, yep, sir.
I'm just going to say, since postmodernism, where people have gone to this idea of relativism, where the definition can be whatever you want, you need to be able to pin down that definition.
Right.
Exactly what the text is saying.
Exactly.
Someone thinks it might say, or
Yeah.
it could say, or something. You have to know. You really need to know
What it says.
Yeah.
Right. So we do word studies to learn what the author intended to communicate with the word in question.
Well, one thing also, through God's wisdom, the New Testament was written primarily with the Koine Greek, which is a dead language,
Yeah.
fixed language, same meaning forever.
Right.
And that's very important for an eternal mindset.
Exactly.
Forward and looking backward.
A document that is not changing. Right. Well, and that's something that we need to understand is the authors had an intended meaning with these words. And people try to play with meanings. And if you've ever had a discussion with somebody who is maybe of a Baptist mindset about Acts 2:38, they might try to say, oh, well, the word that's translated for can mean because of. Well, okay, is that what the author intended? But it's a good question for us to ask. Okay, do we know what the author intended with this word? Or are we reading our own bias onto it? Now this becomes very, very important when we look at some of the quirks of translation. Different English words can be used to translate the same Greek or Hebrew word. And we're going to get into the details of this in a minute. But you may have one Greek word, but it could be translated as multiple different English words. And each of those words has a very slightly different connotation. How do we know what the author intended? Or a single English word can be used to translate multiple Greek words. We're all familiar with the love situation. Multiple different words for love in Greek, one in English. It really takes some of the meaning from the text when you only have one word. And translators are sometimes theologically biased. Sometimes the translators will translate a word a particular way to fit their bias. Think about how our English Bibles say baptism instead of immersion. Baptism is not necessarily a originally English word. It's a transliteration where they took English letters that made the same sounds as the Greek letters and made a new word. Because when the King James Version was translated, the King James had been sprinkled, and if they translated immersion, as the Greek means, they probably would have been beheaded. So that changes our understanding of the text. And sometimes the English wording is not as clear as we might like. It may not be as clear, and so we need to be able to know, what did the original author intend with their words? Now, any thoughts or questions about these points?
That last component is a question I'm constantly asked.
Yeah.
What translation should I use?
Right.
And my comment is always review each of them carefully.
Yeah.
Because, English words don't translate very well.
Right.
Many times.
And towards the end of our word study section, we're going to actually have a class about the different translations, because knowing why the different translations are the way they are and what differences they have makes a big difference. Very much. See, Greek and Hebrew cannot be translated 100% word for word into English while still being readable to the average person. And this is something that, if you haven't studied Greek or Hebrew, you may not necessarily realize. But they don't use the same syntax as we do. And also, the structure of the language itself is different. So, in Greek and Hebrew, but I know more Greek, the word can be modified by its prefix and its suffix, so the letters on the beginning and the end. And so in English, you might need 3 or 4 English words to communicate that. To show us this, I have here a Greek interlinear. Now what an interlinear is it has, in this case, Greek on the top, and right below it, the direct English translation, without any rearranging for proper English vocabulary or sentence structure. And so it really makes it a little different. Now what I want to do is I want to give you all a chance to read from this. So I have here John 3:16. Let's see here. Silas, would you read the English words on the bottom, 14 through 17? Okay?
Okay, and just the words on the bottom,
Yes.
all of them?
Yep, and read that.
And as Moses, he lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so to be lifted up, it is necessary the Son of the Man, in order that the one believing in him, he may have life eternal. In such a way, for he loved the God the world, so that the Son, the only, he gave, in order that the one believing in him, not he might perish, but he might have life eternal. Not for he sent God the Son into the world in order that he might judge the world, but in order that it might be saved, the world through him.
So you see how it's recognizable,
Yeah.
but it's not proper sentence structure for English. And the way that it's put together, there are often 2 or 3 English words per Greek word. Now I want to have us read one more passage. We're going to read Hebrews 10:19 through 20. Oh, it's a good long one. We won't do the whole thing then. We're going to do 10:23 through 25. Alan, would you read that for me? So Hebrews 10, starting there through 25.
Let us hold fast the confession of the hope without wavering, faithful for the one having promised, and let us consider one another for provocation to love and to good works, not abandoning the gathering together of ourselves as the custom with some, but encouraging, and by so much more, by as much as you see coming near the day.
So, familiar passage, right? We've read that passage a dozen times. But in the Greek, it's hard to really catch. You have to really think about what's being said. So, the point that I wanted to make with this is any of our translations, they rearrange the sentence structure to make it more readable. We have a particular sentence structure that we use in English, but it's different than what the Greek used. So, any of our translations, no matter how literal they try to make it, in order to be readable in English, can't be 100% word for word. Now, that presents us with a problem. Because, well, we want to know what it says, we want to know what the original author intended, but if the words aren't exactly the same, if there's not a precise word-for-word translation, then how do we know what they intended? Well, it comes back to our word studies. That's why we're doing word studies. So we did all that discussion to drive home why word studies are important. And I wanted to talk about that because when we start talking about word studies, people who are academically inclined go, woohoo, word studies! People that are not academically inclined go, what? Why? And this is why. Because we want to know what God, through the inspired writers, intended. But we don't have the original language in our Bibles. We do have it, but we don't, most of us don't read it. So how can we grasp it? Well, we do word studies. Any questions about that before we jump into some word study fallacies? Questions, comments? Okay, so let's talk about some word study fallacies. And I wanted to cover these fallacies. Come on in. Wanted to cover these word study fallacies because there's a lot of common questions and common misconceptions that get made. And if we can just take care of those at the front end, then we don't have to keep rehashing them as we go through. So, just to make sure that everybody knows, what's a fallacy?
Lie?
Hmm?
A lie, a fib?
Yeah, a fallacy would be a misunderstanding, a lie, a fib, something that's not true. So, the first one is the English-only fallacy. And this is the assumption that you only need to study the English words, not the original language words. So, you know, pull out your Webster's Collegiate Dictionary and look up your English word. Okay, well, what might be some problems with that particular way of thinking?
Again, going back to what we were talking about earlier about how English words change a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, and different English words are sometimes used to translate one Greek or Hebrew word. So if we just look up the English definition, we might get confused. So here's an example of this. In the King James and New King James, the word for consolation in 2 Corinthians 1:5 and 7:7, I'll read this and then we'll get to the passages. It's also translated as comfort in 2 Corinthians 7:4 and 13, and exhortation in 2 Corinthians 18:17. Let's go there. 1 Corinthians 1:5.
Second Corinthians.
Thank you, 2 Corinthians. Here I'm reading my own slide and misreading my own slide. Sometimes Bible teachers are tired. Okay. Keely, would you read for us 2 Corinthians, oh, you don't have a New King
It's,
James.
I've got mine. Oh, it's actually, mine is ESV on here.
Who's got a King James or a New King James?
King James.
Okay, yeah, would you read 1 Corinthians 1:5? 2 Corinthians 1:5?
For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Christ.
Okay. So, how is that word being used in that context?
As consolation, so it's supposed to make you feel better.
So like comfort, consolation, it's consoling you. Yeah, consoling someone. Okay. Who else has a King James or a New King James? Bob? Could you read the 2 Corinthians 7:4?
Great is my boldness of speech toward you. Great is my boasting on your behalf. I am filled with comfort. I am exceedingly joyful in all our tribulation.
Okay, so how is that word used there?
Comfort? What do you...
So he's being comforted by what's going on, right? Okay, final one. Jim, do you have King James? Could you do 2 Corinthians 8:17 for us?
For indeed he accepted the exhortation, but being more forward of his own accord, he went unto them.
Now, the first few, okay, comfort, consolation, there's we could see the overlap there. But exhortation in English, what connotation does exhortation carry in English?
I want something to happen, and so I'm going to try to urge you on to make this happen.
Right. It's a push you on to something kind of word. That's significantly different than consolation or comfort. Now, you wouldn't know in English that those are all the same Greek word. But they are. And when you start noticing that, remember how we were doing our repeated words, highlighting repeated words earlier on? You wouldn't catch that, would you? That this is a repeated word, that this is a word that he's using over and over again, because it's translated different in different ways, or in different places. So that's one problem with the English-only fallacy. Another problem with the English-only fallacy is that one English word may be used to translate different Greek or Hebrew words. So different English words translated or being used for one Greek word, or different English words, or one English word used for different Greek and Hebrew words. An example is the classic one, that there are 4 Greek words that can be translated as love. Each Greek word has a slightly different meaning. That can cause a problem. Now, we've had lots of discussions on love here. We've talked about love extensively, which is appropriate. But we know there are different types of love. There's brotherly love. There's self-sacrificing love. There's sexual love. There's familial love. Each one carrying a very different connotation. And that's why very often in our modern world, people will say, oh, well, Jesus was a homosexual because this is the apostle who Jesus loved. And our depraved world immediately thinks, well, if you love someone, you must be having relations with them. But that's not the case. Those words mean different things. And the word that's used there is not the word for sexual relations. It is I think that with that one, it's the brotherly love. But I'll have to look that up before I confirm that. But we have these different words, all translated as love. And we don't quite get that in our English. Now, as a side note to this is one of the many problems with the KJV-only doctrine. Just like every English translation, the KJV does not render the Greek and Hebrew 100% accurately. Now, if you're not familiar with that, there are people who believe that the only Bible that you can use and be okay with God is the King James. There's a lot of reasons they believe this. We're not getting into it today, but this is one of the problems with it. is that it is a translation. It is trying to make a readable document out of a ancient language. And they did a good job for the time that it was done with the tools they had. They also did some things that were not so good for political reasons. So, just in case anyone was leaning that direction. If you have more questions about KJV only doctrine and some of the problems with it, you can talk to me later. Okay, so let's talk about solution. Solution to the English only fallacy. What do you think the solution to this one is?
Do a word study.
Do your word studies, yeah. Don't assume that studying the English word is sufficient. Dig into the original language words. Now, I say that. Why is this intimidating?
Where do you find it?
Where do you go? Okay, great, I need to study the original language. How? Okay, we're going to get into that. So, that's our first fallacy. Any questions or comments about that particular fallacy?
We have that same fallacy, just in our own language and use of English. My love for my wife is different than my love for my mother.
Right.
And yet it's the same word, but we understand that word means two different things.
And that's one of the funny things is context. Because of the context, we understand it. But for some reason, when people who have an agenda go to the Bible, context gets tossed out the window, and suddenly words can mean whatever they want them to mean, and it's annoying. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the funny things about doing this. Most of the interpretation principles we talk about in the Bible, we do without thinking in everyday conversation. But somehow we transfer the Bible and people lose their minds. Okay, the next fallacy is the root word fallacy. Now this one is interesting because this gets into the original language. But people that have a shallow understanding of the original language. So this is the idea that the real meaning of a word is found in its original roots or etymology. And you'll often hear people who have just a little bit of knowledge waxing eloquent about how the roots of this word is this, and so that means it actually means this thing. Well, the problem with this, with the root word fallacy, is that the meaning of a word may or may not relate to its root word or words. It may or may not. Sometimes the root words do equal what the word means. Sometimes they don't. And I'll give you some examples in English that we're familiar with. Butterfly. Butter, a substance made out of the fat from cow's milk, plus fly. So is the butter flying? Is it a fly that likes butter?
Is a fly made of butter?
Is it a fly made of butter? None of those are true. Butterflies have absolutely nothing to do with cow's milk. Why are they called that? I have no idea. But if we were to look at it and say, okay, well, butter plus fly equals butterfly, that means that butterflies are actually come out of... No, they don't. Or pineapple. Pine plus apple. So is this an apple that grows on a pine tree? No. Why do we call it pineapple? It's got pine spines or pokey things on it, but I don't know. Why is it called pineapple? The two root words have nothing to do with the actual meaning of the word. Or sawhorse. Okay, are we sawing the horse? Is the horse sawing? This one kind of makes sense because, okay, you got 4 legs, you got a stand, it kind of sort of looks like a horse and you use it for sawing. You can make the logic jump there. But still, if you look at the etymology of the word, it does not equal the meaning of that word. And this happens in Greek. And I decided not to confuse us all with a whole bunch of Greek etymology. But you get the idea here, right? There are some Greek words that absolutely the etymology does equal its actual meaning. There are some Greek words that, like butterfly, the two words together mean something completely different. So, what's the solution? And we're going to start seeing...
Context.
Context! You're going to see that pattern. Give context priority over etymology when determining meaning. Okay, it might be fun to study the etymology of a word. Give the context priority. Just like butterfly, if you were not a native English speaker and someone started talking about butterflies, you need to listen to the context to figure out what they're talking about. They're not talking about, literal butter flying or something. It's a little pretty thing. So, give context priority. And you're going to see this repeated a lot. Okay, any questions about that particular fallacy? Any comments? Okay, our next fallacy is the time frame fallacy. Now, this is the fallacy that is assuming a more modern or more ancient meaning of a word always applies. Basically assuming languages have never changed over time. And this is interesting because Greek and Hebrew are both dead languages now. There was a time that they were living languages. And especially in Hebrew, not so much in Koine Greek because the Bible was written the New Testament was written in a very short time frame. But when you get into Hebrew and some of Greek, there are older meanings for words and newer meanings for words. Especially when you get into extra-biblical literature, which is outside of the Bible. And so you'll often read an article that says, oh, well, at one time, this word meant such and such. Like when we talk about music in Ephesians and Colossians. And they'll say, oh, at one time, this particular word exclusively meant using a mechanical instrument. And so then they say, well, therefore, this is saying it's okay to use, in fact, it's commanding to use a mechanical instrument. But at the time that the Bible was written, the language had changed such that that word meant something slightly different. So, we can't assume that just because a word at one time meant something, that it meant that same thing when the Bible was written.
David,
Yep.
I think a good example would be the word tweet.
Tweet.
40 years ago, the word tweet meant something completely different from what it means right now.
And we're going to get to that because, quite frankly, languages morph and change over time. That's part of what a living language does. And so here's some English translations. Tweet would be a good one. Cool. It's one of my favorite ones. Okay. Is it cold in temperature or is it neat? Those are vastly different meanings for that word, aren't they? Or gay. 100 years ago, if you said someone was gay, that meant they were happy. Now it means they're homosexual. Or the other word for donkey. There was a time that you could say that in polite company and it just meant that particular animal. Now it's a curse word. Vastly different meanings for the word because English has changed.
You'll find a lot of those in the King James.
You find a lot of those in the King James.
Yeah.
And that, again, that's a example.
You have to learn to transliterate on your feet.
Right, and that's one of the problems with the KJV doctrine, again, is English has changed. And so when you get things like the thing about naughtiness, I can't remember how it's worded, overabundance of naughtiness or whatever, in the King James, and people look at that and say, what? Well, let's talk about a biblical example. And this is one of my favorites. Romans 1:16. Let's go ahead and read this. Romans 1:16. And Richard, would you read us Romans 1:16, please?
For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek.
Thank you. So the word power there, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, is translated from the Greek word dynamis. The word dynamite comes from the word dynamis. And so there is a common statement that's made by preachers who don't necessarily know the Greek very well. And they'll say, the gospel is the dynamite of God. And it sounds great, right? Like, ooh, yeah, that sounds cool. Okay, is the gospel the dynamite of God?
No.
What does dynamite do?
Blows things up.
Blows things up. So the gospel is not a destructive explosive. It does not destroy, it builds up. The gospel is not the dynamite of God. It's the power of God unto salvation.
It'd be like saying it was the TNT of God.
Right. Right. So just because the word dynamite comes from the same Greek word doesn't mean that every time we see that Greek word it means dynamite.
Dr. Nobel had to call it something, right?
Had to call it something. Yeah, and power makes sense, right? This is block of power. That makes sense.
Our language took that word and gave it an additional meaning. It wasn't the other way around.
Right. So we can't assume that the definition that someone has given that word actually held true for all of time. So what's the solution to the time frame fallacy? Context! Give historical and textual context priority over popular definitions. And this one can get a little difficult because, okay, how do we know what the word meant in the time frame that it was written? Well, we have to study that word in the time frame that it was written. So we have to do some digging. We have to dig into it. But it's worthwhile so that we can know what the words actually mean. Any questions or comments on this particular fallacy? Okay, this next one is one that I have fallen prey to a few times, and that is the overload fallacy. The overload fallacy, well, words can mean several different things. And this fallacy assumes that all those meanings are included every time the word is used. This is a tempting one because you open up your dictionary, and you've probably seen it even with English words. Well, let's just give my illustration. Spring. Okay, the word spring. I did this. This is directly from Webster's dictionary. So spring can mean to move or jump suddenly or rapidly upward or forward. Spring can mean originate or arise from, as in this sprang from that or springs from that. Spring can also mean the season after winter and before summer. And spring can also mean a resilient device, typically a helical metal coil, that can be pressed or pulled but returns to its former shape when released. So if I say the springs in my car need to be changed, do I mean to move and jump, originate, a season, and a metal helical coil?
Context.
No, context, right. It doesn't mean all of these things. Let's talk about a biblical example. And again, we're going to go back to 2 Corinthians 1, 5, 7, 4, 7, 7, 13, and 8, 17. The word is, I'm going to even try to say paraklesis. Now, we have it translated, we already read through some of these passages. It's translated comfort, it's translated encouragement, it's translated as console. I have that on the next slide. Wow, I just told you what the next slide is. So it can mean comfort, encouragement, appeal, consolation, preaching, urgency, and it goes on. Okay, that's a pretty big range of stuff. Comforting someone and preaching, okay, there's overlap there, but when you're comforting someone, you may not always need to preach at them. And preaching can be comforting. There's a lot of difference there, isn't there? So it may not mean all those things every time it's used. Now, this is why the translators will often translate one Greek word or Hebrew word in a different way. And I just said that that's annoying because when you do your word studies or your word count, it's hard to notice it. But for the sake of readability and understandability, oftentimes they go with what fits the context better. Because the word can mean multiple things. So, with that having been said, what's the solution to the overload fallacy? Context! Give the context priority in determining which definition applies. And it can be tempting. to use the wrong definition because it proves your point. Because like we said, Acts 2:38, okay, the word that's translated for, in some contexts, can mean because of. But in that context, because of the words used, it means for, as in directional. Okay, you can't cherry pick which one you want. You have to use the context to determine what is being intended with that word. Keep.
The other part of that solution then would also be, if you can't necessarily be sure from that context, okay, which one doesn't contradict other parts of Scripture?
Right. And that's something we're going to get into as we get into our word studies.
It's either a qualification or a contradiction.
Right. If it doesn't fit, if a particular translation does not fit with that area. And I'll give you an example. There's I can't remember the exact text, but there is a Greek extra-biblical text that talks about the Romans sinking some ships at sea. They were in a naval battle, and it says they baptized these ships.
That's right.
Okay, did they, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? No, they... Okay, so do we sink people into Christ? No. So, while the same word is used, we need to understand the context. Yes, sir?
Using the naval battle analogy, when you hit a ship and you sink it, well, you are putting it under the water.
Right, you're immersing it. Yeah. Which makes sense, you're immersing the ship. And ships, once immersed, don't generally become unimmersed. Where humans, when immersed, generally do become unimmersed. Gets into a whole long conversation there. But you see the reason why context is key. Good input, everybody. I knew we were going to be just enough time to get this. This is good. Okay, the next fallacy is the word count fallacy. This is when we insist that a word must have the same meaning every time it's used. This is very similar to our previous fallacy. But this, rather than assuming that all the meanings apply, this is a meaning that, assuming that the same meaning must apply every single time. And that's really tempting. It's really, really tempting because it's easy. It's easy to say, okay, this word means only this and exclusively this, end of story, end of discussion, boom. But as we discussed in the previous point, words have different meanings. So
You have to be honest about this stuff.
you have to be honest about this stuff.
Another thing too is it has to make comments, it has to make sense.
It has to make sense.
If it doesn't make sense, you need to go back and find out how come it doesn't make sense.
Why doesn't it make sense? And that right there is a discussion we have to have with a lot of people. Okay, why doesn't it make sense? An example of this is in Ephesians 2:8 and 9, Paul uses works. What's Ephesians 2:8 and 9 say, somebody?
It is by grace you've been saved, not of yourselves, it's a free gift.
Yeah.
That's all I got.
That's it. So Ephesians 2:8 and 9 says, "For by grace you've been saved through faith, and not of yourselves as a gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so we would walk in them." So he, in that context, uses works to refer to attempts to earn or deserve salvation. That you're trying to work your way to heaven, trying to deserve it. But in James 2:14 through 26, James uses works to refer to actions taken in obedience to God. Over in James, and I won't read that whole section, but it's a section we're familiar with. So what use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," and yet does not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. But someone may well say, "You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But you are willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless. And he goes on, he talks about that more. So he's using works to refer to actions taken in obedience to God. God commands us to take care of the needy. If we say, be warm and well-filled, now go away, that's not obeying the command. They're using the same word. It's the same Greek word, but they're using it differently. And this is where a lot of discussions with Baptists or people of that persuasion become difficult, because they say, Ephesians 2:8-9, and we say James 2:14. Okay, they're using the words differently. These passages are not in opposition to each other. They're defining that word differently. So the solution to the word count fallacy is give the context priority in determining which definition applies. Hey, you probably could have told me that already, couldn't you? All right, we have one more fallacy to get through before our time is up. So any questions before I go to the final one?
Just a comment, we don't hold ourselves to that.
Right.
When we speak, why would the Bible be different?
Why would we hold the Bible as... Yeah, exactly. We use the same word differently all the time. It's part of language. We need to understand that's part of the Bible. All right. I think this is our final one. The next one is the word concept fallacy. This one, again, is a really easy... Oh, thank you for getting the bell. I was into what I'm doing. This is the assumption that once you've studied one word, that you've studied the entire context or concept. And this is an easy mistake to make. It's easy to fall into this assumption because we're doing word studies. This should make me understand the concept, right? An example of this would be the word church. In Acts 8:1, the Greek word is ekklesia. Over in Acts 8:1. Now, we'll end up doing a big word study on ekklesia at some point. But we read, Acts 8:1, Saul was in a hard agreement with putting him to death, and that day a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea, Samaria, except for the apostles. So, do we have this word, ekklesia? So if we were to define this word, it would be a mistake to think that studying that one word would tell you everything there is to know about the Lord's church. Will studying the word ekklesia tell you how the church should worship? No. Would studying the word ekklesia tell you how the church should be structured? No. Really, that word just means assembly. It's the same word that's used for a mob later on. So we can't assume that just because we've studied one word that we understand an entire concept in the Bible. Does that make sense? Yes, sir?
I think in the Septuagint, that's actually the word for Leviticus. That's used.
I think you're right.
The call out, those were called out of the Hebrew nation to God.
I believe you're correct. I'd have to look it up again, but I think you're correct.
I think that's the way it was.
Right. So the solution to the word concept fallacy is recognize that a concept in Scripture is bigger than any one word. Just like the concept of baptism is bigger than the definition of immersion, we need to understand that the concept is much bigger than just the word. Okay. Oh, we have one more fallacy. Good thing we have 2 minutes. Selective evidence fallacy. Oh, this one's pretty straightforward. Only using the evidence that supports our opinion about what a word should mean. Okay, we've probably met people like this where they ignore all the evidence that doesn't support their preconceived notion. If we do this, then we'll never actually discover the meaning that the Holy Spirit intended in the text. And it's tempting because sometimes we have a wrong idea. We don't purposefully have wrong ideas, but sometimes we have a wrong idea. And there's one bit of evidence that proved me wrong, and then this little tiny bit of evidence that proved me right, I'm going to choose that little tiny evidence rather than the big body evidence that proved me wrong.
The person deliberately knows that that's being deceptive, that's dishonest.
It's dishonest.
Gotta be honest with this stuff.
Yes, and when this is done in academic circles, it's academic dishonesty. It is lying. So what's the solution?
Context?
Well, close, yeah. This one, not context.
Jesus is the
Certainly
solution.
saying a Smith system.
Right. So we need to humble ourselves to consider all the evidence and go where the evidence points, even if the evidence does not support your preconceived idea. And this is often what happens when we talk to our denominational friends. They'll only listen to the passages that support their idea and not the ones that support different ideas. So, final side note, these fallacies explain why the denominational world often refuses to accept what the Bible teaches, because they use these different fallacies. So, thank you for your attention. We got through that whole section. Yes, ma'am.
Can we say that this class was wicked good?
You sure you can say that?
Just thought I'd throw that in.
Oh. And next week we'll get into the actual word studies. We'll talk about how to choose a word and start talking about how to study a word. So, thank you all.
That's all right, we got a song, we got paper we'll use. And after this, Rich will bring us tonight's lesson. Would you be poured out like wine upon the altar for me? Would you be broken like bread to feed the hungry? Would you be so one with me that God would do just as I will? Would you be life and love my word fulfill? Yes, I'll be poured out like wine upon the altar for you. Yes, I'll be broken like bread to feed the hungry. Yes, I'll be so one with you that I would do just as you will. Yes, I'll be light and love your word fulfill.
Every circumstance. His happiness was based on his
Follow Jesus, standing for the right, holding up his banner in the thickest fight, listening for his orders, ready to obey. Who will follow Jesus, serving him today? Who will follow Jesus? Who will make reply? I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Who will follow Jesus? Who will make reply? I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Who will follow Jesus in life's busy ways, working for the Master, giving him the praise, earnest in the vineyard, honoring his laws, faithful to his counsel, watchful for his cause. Who will follow Jesus? Who will make reply? I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Who will follow Jesus? Who will make reply? I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Who will follow Jesus when the tempter charms, fleeing then for safety to the Savior's arms, trusting in his mercy, trusting in his power, seeking fresh renewals of his grace each hour. Who will follow Jesus? Who will make reply? I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Who will follow Jesus? Who will make reply? I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Who will follow Jesus in his work of love, leading others to him, lifting prayers above? Courage, faithful servant, in his word we see, on our side forever will the Savior be. Who will follow Jesus? Who will make reply? I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Who will follow Jesus? Who will make reply? I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Please be seated. Jim, did the grandchildren make it home with their grandparents?
Yes.
All right, I got that right this week. We've got BBS fast approaching, it's like less than 2 weeks away. Was Mount Juliet involved with us at all?
Yes.
There, okay, we'll talk afterwards. So you can Mount Juliet or the lectureship, for example, if you're willing to open your home, if you have a spare bed to take someone in, let me know, so I can match you up with that person and put you in direct contact. The military call that DIRLAW, direct liaison authorized. You contact them, that way they know who they're staying with, you can arrange all that. The same with the Mount Juliet folks. You're coming up here. What else do we have for announcements? Alan?
I put up a new preaching schedule on the back there. It has like the next 4 months, so September through December. So if you guys want to look on that.
Preaching schedule has been posted for the next 4 months. I tried to turn this on. Is this off? Just so I could see the bushes anyway. What else we have? We've lost some people that we know, Martha and I. We've lost a couple people just today, or last night. So I don't know what their relationship with the Lord was, but they passed. One is my cousin's son, and one was the secretary at the school where Martha worked for a long time. She had since retired and lived in Florida. Other things, events. Richard?
Andrew's on his last leg of his trip back to Austin.
Andrew's on his way back to Austin. I talked with him and said, keep studying nursing. He's studying nursing. Kind of like Christiana, our youngest daughter. is doing the same thing, so encourage him. Hopefully he'll get that done and get his degree, I guess, degree or certificate, whatever they get, make him certified as a nurse. Okay, I've already asked Jim if he would close us in prayer.